Good afternoon, everybody. And we have the privilege today of having with us for Black History Month one of the founders of Black History Month Wales, Humie Webbe. Humie is what you might call a first-generation Windrush child, born in Cardiff of Caribbean parents, and she's lived and worked for a good many years in Bute Town and an enormous variety of work there. She's been a project manager, and she also happens to be a jazz singer. I don't know whether she'll give us the benefit of that in this meeting, and a vocal coach and a radio presenter. But her current job is that she works for the National Training Federation Wales, and she is their lead for equality and diversity, and very much involved, being a training federation. She's very much involved with helping apprentices and various other people of different races to make a better life for themselves. I suppose that's the way that you might express it. Humie is also a co-chair of the Welsh Government's Learning Disability Ministerial Advisory Group, and I'm sure she'll say something about that, and it's linked with her personal and family experience as well. She also helped to start the Bute Town Community Choir with Betty Campbell, whom I must confess I'd never heard of until quite recently, but now there's a statue of her in Cardiff. She was the first black head teacher in Wales, and Humie worked with her to start a choir and led that choir for 10 years, and it actually appeared before the Queen and Prince Philip, and it was quite a prestigious career. And Humie has also received prestigious awards from the Ethnic Minority Welsh Women Achievement Association. So Humie is a woman of many talents and many experiences, and I'm sure she has got quite a lot to share with us. So thank you very much indeed for coming at this very busy time. I know it's not the only Black History Month event you've been involved in, and we are getting towards the end of the month now, but whether that finishes your duties for the month, I don't know. But thanks very much indeed for coming along. We have apologies from Vaughan, who is our Director of Chaplaincy Services. He intended to be chairing this meeting, but various emergencies have cropped up. It's an extremely busy time, and he hasn't been able to join us. But for those who are not joining us today, of course, this will be recorded. It is being recorded, and it will be available on YouTube for anyone who wants to look into it at another time. So thank you very much indeed, Humie, and I now hand over to you to talk, and then we shall probably have lots of questions to fire at you. So over to you.
Thank you, Ray, and hello everyone. I'm really pleased to be here today as part of the university series of conversations to mark Black History Month. And when I was approached to talk today, I was given a sort of interesting outline of how we wanted me maybe to address the topic in my talk. So in the short time I'm with you today, I'll try to address the topics in relation to my experiences as someone who's been involved in equality, diversity and inclusion agenda for a long time. So I'm going to be framing my conversation in the context of engagement, representation and participation in terms of what that looks like or feels like for people from minority ethnic communities living in Wales today. And I'm hoping that the people who are tuning in will have an interest not only in having conversations about race, but also working towards improving their own understanding, their situations and approaches to race relations. So much of my approach to my work and why I'm speaking to you today stems from my background. As Ray said, I am of Caribbean heritage. I'm one of eight children born to my parents. And they moved from St. Kitts, a small island in the Caribbean, to Wales as part of the Windrush generation in the 1950s. 6 of my siblings, including me, were born in Wales, and the majority of them still live here. But I'm going to center my conversation on maybe key moments in my life that changed the way that I thought about my heritage, my culture, and opportunities that were or weren't considered open to me. So I'm going to talk about the first time that I visited St. Kitts as a young person. Also about when I had my son, and then when I moved to Butetown to live and work. And these have key, they had key impacts on the way that I viewed myself as a person of colour or a person from a minority ethnic background living in Wales, and how it's shaped and formed the way in which I work and seek work. So what I'd like to do is maybe give you a little bit of background in terms of my work. As I say, I was born in Cardiff, and I had the privilege of going to the Caribbean, my homeland, St. Kitts, when I was 18. And before that time, I'd always been somebody who worked because I liked, not so much as a career, but I just wanted to work and have money to go out and enjoy my life and so on and so forth. So when I was 18, I was very much, I would say, maybe a party animal. And when I went to the St. Kitts, what I found, I was there for 6 weeks. And what I found is a totally different community to what I had been brought up in. So, you know, I saw people who looked like me running banks, who were on the television, who were presenters, who were premiers, who were judges, who were running shops. And before 18, I hadn't even thought of that as something usual or unusual. But also what instilled in me is the pride that people had in their culture, the pride they had in St. Kitts, and also the fact that they wanted to better themselves. They wanted a better life for themselves. And the heartbreaking fact of bettering themselves in a small island is if you wanted to go to university or college or further your academic career, you had to leave the island. And the majority of the people then, especially my cousins and my family, they chose either America or Canada. Very few chose Britain, which was an interesting fact for me. But when I left the Caribbean after 6 weeks, my whole demeanor and attitude to work and what was possible changed. And so it was then that I thought, well, I don't want to just have a job. I want to be able to do something that makes a difference to other people, but I wasn't quite sure what, because I realized at that point that my parents had made many sacrifices for a better life in Wales, and I was maybe squandering some of those opportunities because I was always considered to be a bright, inquisitive person, and I still am. So one of the things that I did when I came back is I joined a band for various reasons, but one of the things I was asked to join a band because I was brought up in the Methodist Church. I didn't tell you that, Ray, but our family was very much brought up within the church. My mother was a Seventh-day Adventist, but we were brought up as Methodists. My father was a Methodist, so we went to church sometimes 3 times a day on a Sunday. But church and singing and the gospel was very much part of our lives. And and in doing that, and in sort of like pursuing the music and so on, it brought me into a different space as well. We were the only Black family in our Methodist church, but we had a wonderful congregation who embraced us and gave us lots of opportunities I don't think we would have had outside of the church. But we developed our love of singing and performance, and that's what led us to, I suppose, join bands, and eventually, you know, as a semi-professional singer, jazz singer, it brought me into that space as well. But the opportunities very much lay within the church. So from the church, what I found is it also brought me into a space where cultural arts was very much something that was of importance to me, but I found it a way in which I could have a particular voice. And it brought me to the attention of other people. And when I had my son, when I came, I had my son as a, I suppose, a late mother. I had my son when I was late, almost 30 when I had my son. But this was another key moment in my life because my son was born and he was diagnosed with autism. So this was talking about 30 odd years ago. And it was very clear when I was engaging with health and social practitioners that they were interested in the fact that my son was different to other people they'd seen, but they weren't quite sure what it was at the time. So he didn't get a diagnosis until he was about 8 or 9. However, it brought me into the area of health and social care. And this is where I saw inequalities, I would say, around how people from different backgrounds were, I wouldn't say discriminated against, I would say maybe misunderstood in terms of what it was and how to maintain their culture and what it meant to have dignity and care and all those sort of things. And that was also brought to the fore when my father came to live with me, because my father came to live with me when he was 80 and he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's at the age of 81. And again, it sort of brought me into health and social care, again, looking at the different inequalities that were presented to me as somebody who was fighting for better care, not only for my son who was on the autism spectrum, but my father who was had dementia. So when I say fighting, one of the things that I found, because we're talking about race relations and we're talking about, what can people do, there are lots of structures that exist in terms of how people access care and how people access social and health care. And one of the things that I always find that I would have to do in terms of ensuring there was care for my son and my father was to present how their conditions presented for themselves. In terms of my father, there were 5 things that I said that my father is part of his being. And because he was known as somebody who was very smart and very, he was always known as very smart and engaging. There was 5 things that sort of kept my father himself. And that was the ability to wash himself, eat, have a shave, dress himself, and to interact with his peers. And what I found is when we were looking for services for my father, there was very few services for people from his background, from Caribbean background. And because my father had a severe stutter, he found it difficult to communicate. So I became his mouthpiece, even though I didn't want to be his mouthpiece. And what I found is in terms of my father's care, because he couldn't communicate his needs, and my son's care, because he also had a learning disability which affected his speech, I found myself having to not speak on their behalf, but communicate their needs. And I think in terms of when I talked about representation and engagement, one of the things that has driven me in terms of the work that I currently do is an understanding of how systems and protocols and structures are not always aligned to the needs of people who have maybe different cultural needs or different communication needs. And I think that has been highlighted a lot in terms of the COVID pandemic. So in terms of the COVID pandemic, I've been involved with lots of different, I suppose, when I say lots of different things, the Welsh government, in fairness to the Welsh government, what they did is they adopted a different approach to England in terms of how they wanted to keep people safe. And when the data was showing that the disproportionate effect of people from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities were being impacted by COVID and almost daily deaths, they set up a task force, which I was privileged to be part of, to look at why those things were happening. And as a result of the Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities COVID-19 subgroup, there was a really groundbreaking report that produced over 51 recommendations. But in summary, it highlighted the inequalities, not just around health, but in terms of accommodation, housing, employment, education. And it also highlighted the fact that lots of the structures in place had failed in terms of the way that they either understood the needs of the Caribbean and Asian and minority ethnic communities, and the way in which those communities engaged with the different sectors which they worked in. So being involved in that has enabled me also to rethink the way in which I work with groups and communities. And being involved in different organizations that are based in Butetown has also provided me with a space to be connected to those communities, remain connected to those communities, but also have a perspective that enables me to align my work with communities and individuals who may not have the ability for their voices to be heard. So in moving to Butetown, as Ray alluded to, it enabled me to work alongside Betty Campbell, alongside another friend and mentor of mine, Patty Flynn. And what we wanted to do is bring positive attention to Butetown through the medium of music and arts and heritage. And so I was privileged to be involved in a movement, as it was then, you're talking about 30 years ago, where we wanted to ensure that the people in Butetown were presenting their history in the way that they wanted to present it. And Betty Campbell had been a pioneer of Black history in schools from the 1970s. But it wasn't, I suppose, until it was sort of galvanized more in the 80s and 90s, where more people found out about Black History Month. And then the Black Voluntary Sector Network Wales, in which I was chair, one of the first chairs, we had money from the Arts Council to sort of galvanize people's independent efforts across Wales, to actually have funding to start to put down roots, to have a more coordinated approach to mark Black History Month in Wales. So we have, when I say we, there's so many people have been involved in progressing Black history in Wales. And basically it's about ensuring that the history of Wales is not forgotten, but it includes the diverse histories that many of our ancestors have contributed to. For some people who may be new to Black History Month or Black history in Wales, the Black presence in Wales has appeared over centuries. It's not just happened in the last year or so, or the last 10 years, or even before, when the Windrush generation came. It's been involved in a long period of time. So when this time of year comes around, I invariably asked questions about, do we really need Black History Month? Why do we have Black History Month? And during the 18 months, we have seen us, and I say us, we in Wales, leave Brexit, leave the European, leave Europe. So we've had Brexit, we've had COVID. Excuse me a minute. But what we also have is a renewed spotlight on the way in which people view race and discrimination and racism. And for people who are, as I say, tuning into this conversation, one of the things that I have realized in my time as sort of maybe combating equality, diversity, and inclusion is different people come to different realizations, and they come from different experiences. They come from different understanding of what racism means to people. And I haven't touched much about the experiences that I've had, but sometimes they have been direct experiences, especially in the areas of employment. And sometimes they've been indirect experience also in terms of employment. But I think the most discrimination or inequalities that I've seen is in accessing health and social care, and in terms maybe of education, in terms of what people from minority ethnic backgrounds are able to achieve when they want to maybe advance in their careers. So one of the things that I wanted to touch on is maybe one incident, because what I didn't want it to be is a series of me saying, and this happened to me, and this happened to me, and this happened to me. Because as I say, we're having a conversation, and the way in which I approach things is based on my experiences, but also the negative and positive things that have happened to me along my career. Now, I've had a career for over 30 years in the public and third sector, and a lot of it is around stakeholder engagement. I would say it's about how, most of the employment that I've had is about either employers or public sector organizations wanting to know how to either attract diverse communities to their boards or to their employment. How can they improve their recruitment practices, or how they can get more people to engage in a consultation. And one of the things that I always say to people is you have to have clear understanding of why you want to engage with people from diverse backgrounds, and also have conversations, really honest conversations of what that would mean if you had an influx of people from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic community, or an influx of young people accessing your service, or an influx of people from the LGBT community. What would that mean to your service? So one of the things I've tried to do is not be the person who has all the answers. However, what I specialize in is being an enabler, because you have to have two-way, sometimes three-way conversations with people who want to either evoke change or be receivers of that change. So one of the things that I did within my current role, as Ray alluded to, is I am the Strategic Equality and Diversity lead for the work-based learning sector. And my brief is to work with training providers to increase the diversity of apprenticeships. And this is based on research that Estin looked at to say, well, Welsh Government are doing a really good job in terms of addressing apprenticeships, and about 88% of the people who access apprenticeships are passing. However, when we drill down, we're finding that there's only 1.2% at that time of people who are disabled accessing apprenticeships, and maybe only 2.4% of people from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic community accessing apprenticeships. And one of the things I did in my first role was have independent conversations with then it was 19 main providers, just to find out where the challenges lie. What are the challenges? Why do you feel that you're not able to attract people from diverse backgrounds? And many of the providers were not actually doing anything wrong, but they weren't actually engaging with the communities for fear of getting the approaches wrong, and for fear of maybe using the long language, or not putting things in place inadvertently. So one of the things what I wanted to do is, well, now that I'm in post, what I want you to do is utilize me as a conduit for any conversation you want to have so that you have if you're frightened to ask a question, ask me. Use me as your conduit, because what I wanted people to do is not feel that I was there to point a finger and say, well, you've done this wrong, you've done that right, you've done this wrong, you've done that right, but just to ask any question that they wanted to ask about what they were currently doing. And also it gave me an opportunity to find out things that they were actually doing that was quite well, but they were not shouting about it because they were fearing, because the outcomes were as, to increase the diversity was not happening as quick as they wanted, that they were doing something wrong. So for anybody who's maybe looking to increase the diversity of either their workforce or their learnership or their staff, you must be bold enough to ask questions, but then when you have answers, be bold enough to act on those answers. And for myself, who's been, I would say, an enabler, as somebody who has been on the receiving end, a positive and negative receiving end of employment practices, I would say that I've used those experiences to maybe look at inwardly what I can do to not change what I do, but learn from how I can present myself in a way that moves somebody else forward. I'm conscious of the fact that when I do my role, and I'm talking about the roles that I've had maybe in the last 10 years, invariably I am the only person of color in that space. Sometimes I'm in a deficit position as maybe one of few females in that space. So I recognize I have more than one maybe disadvantages to my personal being that presents obstacles. However, what I try to do is draw strength from my experiences, because I've had the privilege to actually work with so many different people from different backgrounds. And it's enabled me maybe to have, I wouldn't say a sympathetic approach to people who are trying to change, but maybe a holistic approach to where different challenges lie. So what I would ask people to consider, especially people who are enabling people as well, is not think of what you can't do or what you won't do, but think of what you will do. And for people like myself who are enablers, who are long-time campaigners of equality, diversity, and inclusion, we have to constantly review how we engage with people, because the way in which we engage with people varies. However, the challenges in some instances remain the same. The conversations sometimes remain the same. So for somebody who's involved in equality, diversity, and inclusion, I constantly reflect on what I can do to change the conversation beyond just me telling somebody, maybe you should try this and maybe you should try that. So I will leave it there, because I think I've spoken enough on my work and my approach to my work. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you very much indeed, Humie. I found it very interesting. I think I've picked up a few things that I haven't really thought about very much before, such as this business of social care. We tend to think, oh, so long as it's provided, so long as the money's there and the staff are there, it works. But you reminded us that there's a difficulty, well, one with people who can't express themselves and really sort of say what they need, and also cultural differences in the way that people are able or unable to access care, which is, I thought, was a very interesting point. And I'm very glad you brought up this question of helping people who are afraid of saying the wrong thing, because I think that is quite a difficulty in race relations, and people hold back because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing, and it needs people like you who can actually listen to them, and instead of just slapping their wrists, can just explain to them how they can do better, really. So thank you very
Yeah.
much indeed. Yeah. If there's anybody here who wants to ask a question, you can put it on the chat, and John will pick it up. But I think John has some questions ready that have been put in, and so I'll ask John to come up with the first one.
Okay.
Okay. One of the questions we've got in, Humie, is about the Tiger Bay and the way it's changed. I mean, obviously now it doesn't bear much resemblance to the Tiger Bay that was, because it's now a modern centre with government, commerce, entertainment down there. So does the old kind of Butte Town community still exist? And if so, sort of how? And how has it been affected with the fact that obviously it's been moved out of that area?
Well, the old community still exists. I remember when my first home when I was a child was in Butte Town. Though I don't remember it, but my father's first home was in Butte Town, and he was 88 when he passed away, and he was about 21 when he came to this country. And I remember when I moved back to Butte Town when I had my son in 1988. One of the residents who told me then, he said, we've been on a building site for the past 50 years. So in the 1980s, they were talking about being on a building site for the last 50 years. So the community is very much still alive. It's very vibrant. One of the first jobs that I had when I moved to Butte Town is working alongside residents, very vibrant residents, and they were part of a group that formed the Butte Town History and Arts Centre. Some people online may remember that. And that was a Butte Town History and Arts Centre that was established by Dr. Glenn Jordan, who came from America, and he came in search of his mentor, who taught about this wonderful, vibrant community called Tiger Bay. And he worked with the community, and he established the Butte Town History and Arts Centre, and it was formed on people bringing their photographs and archives and stories that told about Butte Town. Now, unfortunately, Butte Town History and Arts Centre is no longer there, but there's another organisation which is run by Gaynor Legall, another wonderful, iconic person from Butte Town, who was still collating the histories of Butte Town, and she was the person who was chairing the review of the statues and the names. You have somebody called Keith Morrell, who was from the area, who was very much the person who's revived the carnival, the Butte Town Carnival. So there is still a new generation of people still there, progressing the history, taking up the mantle from Betty Campbell and from Patty Flynn and maybe for myself in some cases, still there. So the community is still very much vibrant, yes. And in terms of what they think of the actual developments, again, there are mixed views around that. I think there is more maybe connections now with maybe what the Wales Millennium Centre are trying to do to stay more connected to the communities, providing a space for the presentation of arts, having more links with the carnival members, the people who run the carnival. And also there's lots of people still involved in maybe some of the consultations that Welsh Government have on the sort of gentrification of the place. So there are mixed views on that. And I know when I was involved in the carnival years ago, there was always some form of, I wouldn't say antagonistic, I would say maybe sort of, you've got an antithesis. You want new things, but you have the recognition of the old things as well. So maybe sometimes the new communities would always sometimes at loggerheads with the existing communities. And I think in terms of how the community has developed now, you've got almost three different areas. You've got the old community, then you've got Atlantic Walk where I live, and then you've got the whole of the Mermaid Quay. And the Buttown ward is such now that in the next election, there'll be 3 councillors. So that demonstrates how big the population is, but how expansive the Buttown ward has become. However, there is still a desire. I'm not sure how strong the desire is, but there is still a strong desire for the Buttown communities, the sort of like established Buttown communities, to actually benefit from the development. How that happens, I'm not sure how that's going to happen, but those conversations really do need to continue to take place, because you have second generation and third generation people from Buttown who are also seeing inequalities. So, you know, there may be an expansion of redevelopment, but in some cases, some of the issues around inequalities, around housing, employment opportunities still remain.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. You mentioned a bit there about the different generations. You know, do you think that the generations which come afterwards? So obviously you're a daughter of the Windrush generation, and you mentioned just how transformative going back to St. Kitts was for yourself in all kinds of ways. How much do you think the Caribbean culture or the African culture, for people who are now second, third, sometimes even fourth or fifth generation, is part of their identity, or is that something they struggle to link with, do you think?
That's an interesting question, because I think it depends on your exposure to your roots. I was brought up in a housing estate in Ely, and there were about, I would say, 5 or 6 prominent Caribbean families. And when I say prominent, they might have gone amiss with maybe the mainstream, but prominent families in terms of who my family connected with. So we would see them, you know, maybe at church, or you'd see them at a christening, or you know, or a wedding, and so on and so forth. So I was very much aware of my Caribbean heritage. It was something that was, you know, I knew about it, and then we stayed connected to our cousins in Newport. So I found there was a strong Caribbean identity within myself and within the Caribbean households that I connected to when I was a child. I think that connection is still there, because since the sort of like coordination of Black History Month, you have seen a new generation of young people in particular wanting to stay connected, and are staying connected to their roots. Now, that has happened through a number of ways. You have an organisation called Race Council Cymru, who sort of are the main sort of coordinators of Black History Month. And one of the things that they've done is bring elders together to tell their stories, but tell their stories in a way that people can actually view it. Very often, you know, from different backgrounds, there is a history of storytelling. There's an oral tradition in all communities. And one of the things that not just Buttown History and Arts Centre, Race Council Cymru, but a lot of organisations have now seen the value in people not just being able to tell their stories, to present them in a way that other people can see the stories and present and see the stories in a way that they want to present them. So there is an exhibition at the moment that's going on in St. Fagans, and St. Fagans and the Senate, and it's a Windrush Elders Caribbean, and it's focusing on people who came to Wales, settled in Wales in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. And these are people with stories to tell. Now, for yourselves, they might not be people who have aspired to be politicians. They've not aspired to be teachers or anything like that, but they've been living productive, valuable lives. And so it's great to see an exhibition that is focused on different types of people with different stories. And it gives an opportunity for people maybe outside of those communities to see the contributions that we've made over the years. My father came to this country and the first thing he did was sign up. He was in the National Service. He did National Service and he was very proud. We still have the photographs of when he was in the army. Now, a lot of people think that people from the Caribbean or from Asian backgrounds didn't participate in the war effort or any of the national service. All these sort of things, all these narratives are now being brought to the fore by first generation and second generation people who are discovering the stories of their fathers and their grandfathers. But what is important now, it's how those stories are being told and celebrated. And now that Wales again has taken the lead and the only UK nation to actually look at the curriculum and adopt the diverse histories into the curriculum, that's another way in which we can celebrate the contributions and another way of bringing to the fore the repositioning, I would say, of the histories. Because one of the things we want people, when I say we, people who are involved in Black history and the presentation of those histories and campaigning for difference, is to adopt the motto, Black history is Welsh history, Welsh history is Black history, because it's so intertwined.
Yes, thank you. One of the questions that we've had in asked, which is in one ways is sort of slightly difficult to possibly to answer, is about what you found is the most constructive response when you're faced with kind of racial prejudice or discrimination.
Well, it depends how it presents itself, because sometimes people overtly know they're being racist. And then some people not really understanding that that is a form of racism. So the only way that I can do is it's like you have to keep, somebody told me you have to keep on keeping on. So if I was crushed by every sort of comment that somebody made or you know, or sideward glance and stuff like that, I wouldn't be able to speak to you now. I would be like distraught by it. What I tend to do is use those experiences, and in some cases I relay the actual incident to the people that have done it, but do it in a way that they maybe can look at themselves and think, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that. So for instance, I recently went to, you know, every so often I sort of look and see, oh, what sort of opportunities are out there for me. So I applied for this quite a high profile post, and it wasn't in with the occasion of you know, intention of getting it, but I thought, you know, let go. And because the more you go to different things, the more you see there's a different level of understanding and engagement, and then you know, it's about, will you be let into that club or not. And I remember going to this meeting, this interview. And it was a strange way of running the interview, and you had to do, I'm not very good at role play or anything like that. I'm not a very good person with the role play. And anyway, you had to do some form of role play. And then this interview thing lasted for a long period of time. And then as the interview went on and stuff, I knew I wasn't going to get the post when the person who was conducting the interview and stuff just remarked about, oh, I love your hair. Your hair is so, and she almost reached out to, because at the time, you know, I had my hair in cornrows and stuff. She almost reached out to touch it. And I thought, okay, I haven't got the job then. And I And one of the things that most probably that person didn't understand is maybe their perception of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in an interview situation, and what is presents itself as what is acceptable, what's not acceptable. And one of the things that people I find fascinating is when I go to interviews and they're more fascinated about my hair or my external activities as a jazz singer than they are about what I have to say and what I can bring to the table at an interview. And sometimes if it happens and I've got an opportunity to actually demonstrate that at an interview, I might say, well, in some cases when people say, well, what do you bring to the table? And I might find ways of which I can frame that. Because one of the things that I have found is when you're a person of color, when you're a person maybe considered to be at a disadvantage, is that you're bringing your whole being, and in some cases you have to be exposed in what it is that how you're going to approach a particular role. And some people are maybe not ready for that different approach, and there are some organizations that are. So my approach is to always come with my whole being, regardless of what has happened before, because otherwise you're presenting a disingenuous version of yourself. So I use those experiences and I use those in ways that I tell other people in different situations, so that if they're coming across somebody and that person is somebody of color and stuff like that, they may not decide to use that language or use that approach and say, oh, I love your hair and and stuff, instead of focusing on what they're bringing to the table in terms of their skills and their abilities. So I use all the experiences whenever I can, because sometimes people are not being racist as such. However, if a person feels something, then that person feels it, if you see what I mean. Because somebody may not intend their actions to be racist, but if somebody feels that they are, then it should enable you to reflect on how you've made that person feel.
Yes, thank you. I resonate somewhat with that, being Welsh, because I find when I'm with English people and they find out I'm Welsh, they say things like, "Oh, you must be a good singer," or you know, you must be a rugby supporter, and you know, my thought is, well, that's not the whole of me. That's a stereotype.
No.
I
Yeah.
actually do like singing, and I've got quite a good voice, but that's just part of me. And as far as rugby is concerned, I'm not the least bit interested in it. You know, find out who I am before you make remarks.
Yeah, and I think people do that. People sort of, even though they don't mean to, they have a stereotypical view of a person, of you know, what somebody brings or not bring, and again, they don't know all your background. I found I did a period of work where I worked in London, and I found the further away I got from Wales, the more Welsh I became, because people would say, oh, I love your Welsh accent. I said, well, I haven't got a Welsh accent. And then I realized, of course, I'm coming from Wales and I'm in England and I'm doing this work. And to them, I've got a Welsh accent. So they had to get over that, the fact that somebody, a black person, is speaking to them with this heavy Welsh accent that they found was quite, you know, pronounced. You know, so it's, I think, as you say, people have more than one identity. And I think, especially in recruitment sites and about people sort of not saying the right thing or saying the right thing, there are ways in which you can familiarize yourself with current dialogue and current discourse. And language is one of the, I would say, current ongoing discourses when you're talking about race and racial discrimination or racism, and the way in which people are called or what moniker you give them. But that can't be the reason why conversations don't happen. Because if you're open to the fact that, okay, because I remember I was mortified when I was, because part of my work, when I was the National Diversity Coordinator for Mind Cymru, is I did a lot of work with the LGBT community, and it was a time when they were doing Youth Cymru were doing a transgender conference, and they did some wonderful work, and my role was trying to ensure that, you know, the transgender community had their voice within the sort of mental health stigma. And I did this event, and it was a wonderful event, and I inadvertently, when I was doing my presentation, misgendered somebody, and I was mortified. I was absolutely mortified, but they were generous enough to say that's fine and just moved on. Do you know what I mean? So, because I know it can happen, and when you do, you feel so awful that you've done something that is mortifying. But if you continue to do that, then you haven't learned anything.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? So, because a lot of the work that I did around mental health is having an understanding of, you know, the transitional support or not that's available for somebody when they're transitioning their gender, and having to present a view of themselves to ensure that they get the right support, the right medication. That is quite challenging all the time. So I learned a lot in that space, and I think, when you're involved in equality, diversity, and inclusion, the onus is on yourself to challenge your perspective on things, go outside of your own particular characteristic. And I think for those of us involved in trying to enable change also, very often people's views, especially when they're in the equality, diversity, inclusion agenda, are not challenged. And I'm one of those people that say, I'm glad you're talking about race, but are you talking about disability within race? Because I see nobody here that's disabled within this space. I've gone to conferences where they're talking about disabilities, and I've not seen a person of colour in that space. And I've been in a room with 300 people, and I might count, you know, and I'm thinking, well, somebody's not involved in this conversation here, you know. So we can all do our bit. That's what I'm saying. Is the onus is on everybody to rethink the way they engage, reflect on the way they're engaged, because otherwise we're not going to have healthy conversations if we're only comfortable talking within the sphere of our experience and knowledge.
Yes, thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. The time has flown.
Yes, I think probably this one might be a good one to finish with. Just thinking a bit about the future of race relations in Wales, what kind of worries you about that? And maybe just to finish, what makes you hopeful?
Okay, well, again, Wales has adopted an anti-racist stance. So basically, what they said, all the things that I've been involved with Welsh government, is that Wales have recognised that there are structures in place that affect people's ability to progress and get services. So taking an anti-racist stance is a really proactive way of addressing racial discrimination and racial inequities. So what worries me is that beyond the next tenure, the Welsh tenure, the next 5 years, that we may have a government that is not as progressive and open and collaborative in their approach to addressing race. I am heartened by the fact that we have a Wales Race Equality Action Plan that has been informed by so many different voices on the sort of racial agenda, and Wales has adopted a very engaging approach to ensure that different types of diverse communities have been involved in the production of that plan. However, the more people that are involved, the more expectation there is about outcomes. We're trying to achieve an anti-racist Wales by 2030. We're in 2023. 2021 now. Is it 2030 they want? Yes, I'm sure it's 2030. Now, a lot of people say, well, we should be doing that now, and we should be doing it. But I recognize the fact that people have their own personal journeys, their own personal understanding of what they want in terms of achieving an anti-racist Wales. And the one message that I would like to give people who are on that journey is adopting an anti-racist stance does not mean that you have to recognize you are a racist. An anti-racist stance is about what you've agreed to, what you're committed to, what you're able to do, and what you will do to ensure that everybody, from regardless of their background, has a starting point that is about equity. And I say equity over equality because you can't get equality if you don't have a recognition that there are inequities. And inequities are things that can be changed. Structures can be changed. These structures sometimes they exist because they're made by males and females. People have written something. People have written a policy. People have written something, and it's not enabling people to progress or to have better outcomes. So I would say to people, if you adopt an anti-racist stance, you have to look at what you are willing to do, what you will do, not what you can't, what you don't, what you won't, is what you will do. Because it starts with an individual making a choice to do something different and be bold in that decision.
Yes, thank you. Well, the hour is just about up, and thank you very much indeed, Humie. It's been a very enlightening time, and as I said before we started, it's better that we should end when people still feel they've got questions to ask.
Well, thank you very much. As I've enjoyed being with you today, and I hope people can take something from it, and I hope they will continue to engage with the conversation.
Yes, I think the important thing is that we all need to be aware of what we can do, as I say, and we may think we're not racist, but we've got to be. It's not enough not to be racist. We have to be actively anti-racist in the sense of looking at everything, examining everything, and making sure that that there is the equity. Yeah. Well, thank you very much indeed for coming, and we hope to have contact with you again, and wish you all the best in the tremendous amount of work that you're doing.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, John. Thank you.
This, as I say, this will be recorded, and people will be able to join in, and I'm sure enjoy the talk and your answers to the questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.